Thank you for clicking on this video. Remember to like, share and subscribe to continued stories. Also remember to click the notification bell so you can be notified whenever a new content is uploaded. In this video, we look at 10 controversial colonial monuments in various parts of the world. This video is for educational purposes. 1. Statue of Christopher Columbus. The Christopher Columbus statue is a common point of interest and contention in various cities around the world. Christopher Columbus, an Italian explorer, is often celebrated for his voyages to the Americas in 1492, which led to the widespread European colonization and the creation of the transatlantic slave trade. However, his legacy is also marked by numerous atrocities committed against the indigenous peoples of the Caribbean islands he encountered, particularly the Taino people. Some of these atrocities include forced conversion to Christianity. Columbus and his men often used violence and coercion to convert native peoples to Christianity. Those who resisted were punished or killed. Enslavement. Columbus enslaved thousands of Taino people, treating them as property to be bought, sold, and traded. He sent many back to Spain as slaves and forced others to work in the gold mines and on plantations. Brutal treatment and exploitation. The indigenous people were subjected to harsh labor conditions, often working long hours with minimal food and rest. Punishments for not meeting the Spanish demands were severe, including mutilation and death. Introduction of diseases. The Europeans brought diseases like smallpox, measles, and influenza to the New World, to which the native populations had no immunity. These diseases devastated the Taino and other indigenous communities, leading to widespread death and suffering. Genocide. The Taino population declined dramatically in the decades following Columbus's arrival, primarily due to diseases, but also from direct violence, overwork, and famine caused by European colonization. Some historians argue that Columbus's actions amount to genocide. Sexual violence. There are accounts of Columbus and his men engaging in rape and sexual exploitation of native women, including young girls. Torture and mutilation. To ensure the natives complied with their demands for gold and other resources, the Spanish often resorted to torture, including cutting off hands and noses of those who failed to meet their quotas. Forced labor and the encomienda system. The Spanish implemented a system where they granted land and indigenous people to colonists, who then had the right to use the labor of the inhabitants in exchange for their Christianization and protection. This led to widespread abuse and mistreatment of the native population. Destruction of indigenous societies. The imposition of European culture, religion, and governance dismantled the complex societies and ways of life of the Taino and other native peoples. Their land was taken, and their traditional practices were suppressed or eradicated. Environmental devastation. The arrival of Europeans brought new crops, animals, and agricultural practices that altered the natural landscape and ecosystems of the Caribbean islands, often leading to soil depletion and the extinction of native species. These actions and policies had a lasting negative impact on the indigenous populations of the Americas and set a precedent for the violent colonization that would follow. Columbus's legacy has been re-evaluated by many in recent years, with some calling for a reassessment of the celebration of Columbus Day in favor of acknowledging the suffering of the native peoples and their contributions to history. 2. Cecil Rhodes statue, located at University of Cape Town, South Africa. The statue of British colonialist Cecil Rhodes sparked the Rhodes Must Fall movement in 2015, which called for its removal due to his role in the colonization of Southern Africa and advocacy for racial hierarchies. Cecil Rhodes was a British businessman, politician, and imperialist who played a significant role in the colonization of Southern Africa. His actions and policies have been widely criticized for their ruthlessness and their negative impact on the indigenous populations. Some of the atrocities associated with his rule include land theft and displacement. Rhodes was the founder of the De Beers Diamond Company and played a key role in the colonization of Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe and Zambia. He used the British South Africa Company, BSA, to claim vast territories, often through treaties that were coercive or unfair to local leaders. This led to the displacement and dispossession of many Africans from their lands. The Matabele and Ndebele Wars, Rhodes' desire to expand the British Empire into southern Africa resulted in violent conflicts with the Matabele and Ndebele peoples, known as the First and Second Matabele Wars. Thousands of Africans were killed in these conflicts, and many more were displaced or had their lands and cattle confiscated. The Jameson Raid, Rhodes supported the Jameson Raid, a military incursion into the South African Republic, now South Africa, in 1895. This raid was intended to overthrow the Boer government and annex the Transvaal to Rhodesia. It failed and led to increased tension between the British and the Boers, contributing to the outbreak of the Second Boer War. The Shona and Ndebele genocide. Under Rhodes' rule, the Shona and Ndebele peoples in what is now Zimbabwe were subjected to severe repression and violence. This period is known as the First Matabele War, 1893 to 1894, and the Second Matabele War, 1896 to 1897. Estimates of the death toll range from tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands due to warfare and famine caused by the disruption of agriculture. The Rhodesian native labor policy. Rhodes implemented policies that forced Africans to work for European settlers under harsh conditions. This included low wages, passed laws that restricted movement, and severe penalties for labor dissent. The policy was essentially a form of forced labor and led to significant suffering for the African population. Racial segregation and discrimination. Rhodes was a proponent of racial segregation and believed in the superiority of the Anglo-Saxon race. His vision for Southern Africa included a system of white minority rule, with limited rights and opportunities for Africans. The exploitation of resources. Rhodes and the BSA's interests in minerals, especially diamonds and gold, led to the exploitation of Africa's natural resources, often with little regard for the environmental and social consequences. The creation of the Rhodes Scholarship. While the scholarship has provided educational opportunities for many, it is also a reminder of his imperialist legacy. The scholarship was established in his will to cultivate future leaders who would support British imperial interests. The use of the indigenous population as a labor force. Rhodes was instrumental in the development of the Southern African migrant labor system, which relocated Africans from their lands to work in mines and plantations, often under inhumane conditions. The Scramble for Africa, and the Berlin Conference. While Rhodes did not directly participate in the Berlin Conference, his actions and influence were part of the broader European colonization movement that resulted in the arbitrary division of Africa, leading to long-term political instability and underdevelopment for many African countries. Rhodes' legacy is a complex one, and while he is remembered for his contributions to the development of infrastructure and the formation of modern southern African states, his imperialist ambitions and the atrocities committed under his watch remain a significant part of the region's history. 3. Statue of King Leopold II located in Brussels, Belgium. King Leopold II is criticized for his exploitation of the Congolese people and the atrocities committed under his rule, including the deaths of an estimated 10 million Africans during the rubber boom in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. King Leopold II of Belgium is infamous for the atrocities committed during his rule over the Congo Free State, a vast area of Central Africa that he claimed as his personal possession and exploited for its natural resources, particularly rubber. His regime, which lasted from 1885 to 1908, is marked by a series of human rights abuses and acts of brutality that had a devastating impact on the indigenous population. Here are some of the key atrocities associated with his reign. Enslavement and forced labor. The Congolese were forced to work under extremely harsh conditions in rubber plantations and other industries. Those who failed to meet the required quotas faced severe punishment, which often included mutilation. It is estimated that tens of millions of Africans were enslaved under his regime. Mutilation and torture. The most notorious form of punishment was the cutting off of hands. This was done to punish those who did not meet their rubber collection quotas or to serve as a deterrent to others. It is believed that the hands of men, women, and children were severed as proof of punishment meted out. Other forms of torture included whipping, flogging, and burning. Execution and massacres. The Congolese population was subjected to numerous mass executions. People were killed for resisting forced labor, for not working fast enough, or for attempting to escape. The death toll from these massacres is difficult to quantify but is thought to be in the millions. Death from overwork and disease, the forced labor system and harsh living conditions led to widespread illness and exhaustion. Workers were often malnourished and lived in unsanitary camps, which contributed to the spread of diseases like smallpox and sleeping sickness. The combination of these factors resulted in a dramatic decline in the population. Land theft and resource exploitation. King Leopold and his agents claimed vast tracts of land for themselves, often without any regard for the people living there. This led to displacement and the destruction of local communities' traditional ways of life. The land was used for resource extraction, primarily rubber, which was in high demand in Europe for the production of tires and other goods. Economic exploitation. The wealth generated from the exploitation of the Congo's resources went almost entirely to the Belgian government and private companies. The Congolese people received almost no benefit from the exploitation of their own land and resources, and the country remained impoverished despite its wealth. Cultural and social destruction. The imposition of European culture and religion, along with the breakdown of traditional social structures due to the forced labor system, led to the loss of cultural practices and the weakening of social bonds within Congolese communities. Sexual violence. Women and children were frequently subjected to rape and sexual slavery by the soldiers and agents of the Free State. Cover-ups and propaganda. King Leopold and his supporters actively covered up the atrocities, portraying the Congo Free State as a benevolent project of civilization and progress. This was facilitated by their control over information leaving the region. The role of the force public. The force public, the colonial military, was notorious for its brutality. Composed mainly of Africans commanded by European officers, it was responsible for enforcing the rubber quotas and suppressing any form of resistance. The scale of the atrocities committed under King Leopold's rule was exposed by missionaries and journalists such as Edmond Dean Morel, Roger Casement, and Joseph Conrad, which eventually led to international outcry and the establishment of the Belgian Congo as a formal colony, with the aim of ending the abuses. However, the damage to the Congolese people and the long-term consequences of the exploitation under Leopold's regime are still felt in the region today. The death toll is estimated to be anywhere between 3 million to 15 million people, making it one of the most catastrophic episodes of colonial exploitation in history. 4. Statue of General Robert E. Lee, Charlottesville, Virginia, USA. The monument of the Confederate general became a focal point of racial tension and was removed following the 2017 Unite the Right rally, which ended in violence. General Robert E. Lee is a controversial historical figure, primarily known for his role as a commanding general of the Confederate States Army during the American Civil War. While Lee is often celebrated in the southern United States for his military tactics and his perceived sense of honor and duty, he is also associated with the atrocities that occurred under his command and the broader context of the war, which was largely about the preservation of slavery. Some of the atrocities linked to Robert E. Lee and the Confederate Army include: defending slavery. Lee was a slave owner and actively defended the institution of slavery, which was the primary cause of the Civil War. The Confederate States seceded from the Union to preserve their right to own and exploit enslaved Africans and African Americans. Treatment of prisoners of war. During the Civil War, both Union and Confederate forces committed atrocities regarding the treatment of prisoners of war. However, Lee's army was known for its poor treatment of Union soldiers, particularly at prisons like Andersonville and Libby Prison, where thousands died from starvation, disease, and exposure. Fort Pillow Massacre. In April 1864, Confederate forces under the command of General Nathan Bedford Forrest, but under Lee's broader strategic guidance, attacked Fort Pillow, a Union garrison in Tennessee. After the fort was captured, there were reports of a massacre of African American soldiers who had surrendered. While Lee did not order the massacre, his failure to ensure that the surrender was honored and that the soldiers were treated humanely is a dark stain on his record. The use of slaves as human shields. There are documented instances where Lee used enslaved people as human shields during battles, forcing them to perform dangerous tasks such as building fortifications or carrying supplies under enemy fire. The killing of Union soldiers who had surrendered. throughout the war, there were instances where Lee's troops did not take prisoners but instead killed Union soldiers who had surrendered. One notable example is the Battle of the Wilderness in May 1864, where Lee's forces allegedly killed a significant number of surrendered Union troops. The Shermans marched to the sea. While Lee did not participate in this campaign, his defense of the southern states and the prolonging of the war contributed to the devastation and suffering of the southern civilian population. The march, conducted by Union General William Tecumseh Sherman, was a scorched earth policy intended to demoralize the Confederacy and disrupt their ability to wage war. The Siege of Vicksburg. During this prolonged siege in 1863, Lee's forces and the Vicksburg garrison under his strategic command subjected the city's civilian population to severe hardship. The siege led to the eventual surrender of the city and was a significant turning point in the war. The Battle of the Crater. In July 1864, during the siege of Petersburg, a mine explosion created a gap in the Confederate lines. Union troops, including African American soldiers, were sent in to attack but were slaughtered by Confederate defenders. The battle ended with the execution of many black soldiers who had been taken prisoner. The conditions of his own slaves. Although Lee's personal views on slavery are complex and have been debated, the conditions of the enslaved people on his family's plantations were severe. After the war, freed people who had been enslaved by the Lee family reported harsh treatment and abuse. The execution of deserters. Both the Union and the Confederacy executed deserters. However, the Confederacy was known for its harsher treatment, including the execution of hundreds of its own soldiers. As a commanding general, Lee would have had to enforce such military policies, contributing to the deaths of those who attempted to flee from the battlefields. It's important to note that while Lee is often seen as a hero in the South, his legacy is deeply intertwined with the inhumanity of slavery and the suffering caused by the Civil War. The atrocities listed here are not solely the work of one man but are part of the larger context of the conflict and the defense of the Southern states' way of life, which was heavily reliant on slavery. 5. Statue of Edward Colston, Bristol, UK. Colston was a prominent 17th-century slave trader. His statue was toppled during the 2020 Black Lives Matter protests, prompting debates about the glorification of historical figures associated with slavery. Edward Colston, 1636–1721, was an English merchant, philanthropist, and member of Parliament who made a significant fortune through his involvement in the Atlantic slave trade. Despite his philanthropic efforts, his legacy is tarnished by the suffering and exploitation associated with his commercial activities. Here are some key aspects of his controversial history. Slavery. Colston was a prominent member of the Royal African Company, which was involved in the transportation and enslavement of Africans. This company held a monopoly on the English slave trade from 1660 to 1698, during which time it is estimated to have been responsible for the forced transportation of approximately 84,000 enslaved Africans across the Atlantic. The conditions on these ships were notoriously harsh, with high mortality rates among the enslaved due to diseases, overcrowding, and inhumane treatment. Financial gains. Through his involvement in the slave trade, Colston amassed a substantial fortune that he later used to fund various charitable projects in Bristol, where he lived. These projects included schools, almshouses, and hospitals. However, his wealth was directly linked to the profits made from the exploitation and suffering of enslaved Africans. Philanthropy. Despite his involvement in the slave trade, Colston is remembered for his generosity in Bristol, where he donated large sums of money to various charitable causes. He established several schools, including Colston School, and supported the city's poor and needy. This dual legacy has led to a complex discussion about whether his charitable deeds can justify or overshadow his role in the slave trade. Public commemoration. After his death, Colston was commemorated with statues and buildings named in his honor. In Bristol, a statue of him was erected in 1895, which became a focus of controversy and protest due to his role in the slave trade. Criticism and reassessment. In recent times, there has been a growing movement to reassess the legacy of historical figures associated with slavery and colonialism. The Edward Colston statue in Bristol became a target of such scrutiny. It was toppled during a Black Lives Matter protest in June 2020 and later thrown into the harbour. The event sparked debates about the public commemoration of controversial figures and the need to address the historical legacy of slavery and racism. Legal impact. Colston's involvement in the slave trade also had legal implications. He was one of the key figures in the establishment of the triangle trade between England, Africa, and the Americas, which was the economic foundation of the British Empire's involvement in slavery. In conclusion, Edward Colston's legacy is a complex one, marked by significant philanthropy on one hand and deep complicity in the atrocities of the slave trade on the other. His story is a reminder of the darker aspects of British colonial history and the moral questions that arise when considering the legacies of individuals who profited from the suffering of others. 6. Statue of General Arthur Currie, Ottawa, Canada. Currie is celebrated for his role in World War I, but his involvement in the Winnipeg General Strike of 1919, where he used military force against civilians, has made his legacy controversial for some. Arthur Currie was a Canadian general during World War I, known for his command of the Canadian Corps, particularly during the Battle of Vimy Ridge and the 100 Days Offensive. While he is generally regarded for his tactical skill and contributions to the Allied victory, like any military leader in a war, Currie's decisions and actions have been the subject of scrutiny and controversy. However, the term atrocities typically refers to war crimes or acts of extreme cruelty, and there is no evidence to suggest that Arthur Currie himself committed atrocities in the same sense that the term is commonly applied to leaders such as those involved in the Holocaust or the Rwandan genocide. Currie's tactics and decisions during the war did, however, lead to significant casualties among his own troops, which some might consider controversial or harsh. For example, he is often criticized for the high casualty rates incurred by the Canadian forces under his command, especially during the Battle of Passchendaele in 1917. The battle was part of the Third Battle of Ypres, where the Canadians were tasked with capturing the village of Passchendaele, which was heavily fortified by the Germans. Despite the difficult terrain and weather conditions, Currie pushed his men forward, resulting in over 15,000 Canadian casualties for relatively small territorial gains. Another controversial decision was the execution of soldiers for desertion or cowardice. Currie, like many military leaders of his time, upheld the harsh discipline of the British military code, which included the death penalty for such offences. Although he did not personally carry out these executions, he did authorize them as part of his duty to maintain discipline within his troops. It is important to note that the context of war often forces commanders to make difficult decisions that result in loss of life, and Currie's primary objective was to achieve military victory and protect his soldiers within the constraints of his orders and the strategic situation at hand. The criticism of his methods is more about the broader ethical questions of warfare and the consequences of military strategy rather than personal acts of atrocity. Currie's reputation is generally mixed, with some praising his leadership and tactical acumen and others questioning the cost of his victories in terms of human lives. 7. Statue of Captain James Cook. Various locations in Australia and New Zealand. Cook's voyages are seen as the beginning of British colonialism in these countries, leading to the dispossession and suffering of indigenous populations. Captain James Cook was a British explorer, navigator, and cartographer who is best known for his 3 voyages around the world between 1768 and 1779. During his expeditions, Cook made significant contributions to the European understanding of the Pacific Ocean and the land surrounding it. However, his interactions with indigenous peoples were not always peaceful, and some of his actions and those of his crew have been characterized as atrocities. One of the most well-documented incidents occurred during Cook's third voyage, on February 14, 1779, in Kealakekua Bay on the island of Hawaii. Cook had returned to the islands to resupply his ships and continue his exploration. Initially, the native Hawaiians had welcomed Cook and his crew, mistaking them for gods. However, as the Europeans began to take resources and impose their will on the local population, relations deteriorated. Cook attempted to take the Hawaiian king, Colonial, hostage to ensure the return of a stolen boat. This led to a confrontation, and Cook was killed by the Hawaiians. In the aftermath, Cook's men retaliated by killing several indigenous people and burning their canoes and homes. The event is now known as the death of Captain Cook. Cook's voyages also led to the spread of diseases like smallpox, which had a devastating impact on the native populations who had no immunity to these European illnesses. While Cook himself did not directly introduce the disease, the movement of his ships and crews inadvertently facilitated the spread of these pathogens, resulting in significant mortality rates among the indigenous communities. Furthermore, the European explorers and colonizers who followed in Cook's wake often exploited the resources and land of Pacific islands, disrupting local cultures and ecosystems. This period of colonization included the forced displacement of native peoples, the taking of their lands, and the imposition of European cultural norms and religious practices. It is essential to note that while Cook was not directly responsible for all the negative consequences of European expansion in the Pacific, his voyages were part of the broader context that led to the colonization and often violent encounters between Europeans and Pacific Islanders. The impacts of his explorations were complex and had lasting effects on the indigenous populations. 8. Nelson's Column. Nelson's Column, located in Trafalgar Square in the heart of London, is a prominent monument commemorating the life and achievements of Admiral Horatio Nelson, who played a significant role in the Battle of Trafalgar during the Napoleonic Wars. The column was constructed between 1840 and 1843 and is considered a symbol of British naval power and heroism. However, the history behind the column is not without its share of controversy. The Battle of Trafalgar, the controversy surrounding Nelson's column is largely tied to the event it commemorates, the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805. The battle was a decisive victory for the British Royal Navy, leading to the decline of the French and Spanish fleets and securing British dominance of the seas. However, the battle was also a costly one, with significant loss of life on both sides, including that of Admiral Nelson himself. Some argue that the glorification of war and the elevation of Nelson to a national hero overlooks the human cost of military conflict. Slavery and Nelson's legacy. Nelson was a product of his time, and his legacy is tied to the era of British imperialism and colonialism, which included the practice of slavery. While Nelson is celebrated for his naval victories, some question whether it's appropriate to venerate a figure who operated within a system that upheld slavery. There have been calls to reassess the heroic status of figures like Nelson in the context of Britain's historical involvement in slavery and its legacy. Design and cost. The design of Nelson's column was the subject of much debate and controversy in the early 19th century. Initially, a statue of Nelson on horseback was proposed, but this was rejected due to concerns about the cost and practicality. The final design, by William Railton, features a Corinthian column topped by a statue of Nelson. The total cost of the monument was £47,000, which was a substantial amount at the time. The expense was largely covered by public subscription, but some criticized the project as extravagant and unnecessary, especially in the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars when the country faced economic challenges. Political symbolism. The column was also a political statement. Its construction coincided with a period of social unrest in the UK, and some historians argue that it was intended to reinforce British nationalism and the power of the state. The choice to place the column in Trafalgar Square, a public space that was previously used for political protests, was seen by some as an attempt to assert control and impose a narrative of triumph and national unity. The toppling of statues. In the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement and the re-evaluation of historical figures' roles in slavery and colonialism, there have been debates and even some protests calling for the removal of Nelson's statue from the top of the column. These discussions reflect a broader controversy about how societies should engage with and commemorate their complex pasts. The lions and the fountains. The 4 lions at the base of the column were not part of the original design and were added later. Sculpted by Edwin Landseer, they were criticized by some as an unnecessary embellishment and an overemphasis on military power. The fountains that now surround the column were added in the late 1930s and early 1940s as part of a redesign that aimed to reduce the amount of traffic in the square. This alteration to the original space has been debated for its impact on the monument's aesthetic and historical integrity. Vandalism and restoration. Throughout its history, Nelson's Column has been the target of vandalism, including the repeated theft of the lion's bronze tails and the defacing of the statue. The column has undergone several restorations, with the most significant taking place in the early 21st century. Some argue that the ongoing preservation efforts are a testament to the enduring controversy over Nelson's legacy and the need to continually confront and discuss the nation's history. In summary, Nelson's Column is a significant historical landmark that has sparked various controversies related to the commemoration of war, the legacy of colonialism and slavery, and the public's evolving attitudes towards historical figures. 9. John A. McDonald Statue. Various locations in Canada. MacDonald is considered Canada's founding father but is also vilified for his policies toward Indigenous peoples, including the creation of residential schools and the suppression of the Metis rebellions. John A. MacDonald, the first Prime Minister of Canada, is a controversial figure in Canadian history due to his involvement in several events that have had lasting negative impacts on Indigenous peoples and other marginalized groups. Here are some of the key atrocities and controversies associated with his leadership. Residential school system. One of the most significant and devastating legacies of MacDonald's government is the creation and expansion of the residential school system. This system aimed to assimilate Indigenous children into European Canadian culture by forcibly removing them from their families and communities and placing them in boarding schools where they were often subjected to physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, as well as neglect and forced labor. The system led to the loss of language, culture, and identity, and has had intergenerational traumas for Indigenous peoples. The Indian Act. MacDonald's government introduced the Indian Act in 1876, which was designed to control and regulate the lives of First Nations people in Canada. The Act included measures such as the forced assimilation of Indigenous children into the residential school system, the outlawing of Indigenous cultural practices, the imposition of a paternalistic band council system, and the denial of basic human rights such as the right to vote and to leave reserves without permission. Starvation policy. MacDonald's government implemented a starvation policy during the construction of the Canadian Pacific Railway, withholding food and essential supplies from Indigenous communities to force them off their lands and onto reservations. This was part of a larger strategy to clear the land for European settlement and the expansion of Canada's national project. The Northwest Resistance. MacDonald's government responded to the resistance of Metis and First Nations peoples in the Northwest Territories with military force, leading to the Battle of Batoche and the hanging of Metis leader Louis Riel in 1885. This event is also known as the Northwest Rebellion, but it was a direct result of the federal government's failure to address the concerns of the Metis and First Nations regarding their rights and treatment. Head tax on Chinese immigrants. In 1885, under MacDonald's leadership, Canada introduced the Chinese Immigration Act, which levied a head tax on Chinese immigrants to discourage them from entering the country. This tax was later raised multiple times and was not fully repealed until 1923. It was a form of racial discrimination that significantly affected the Chinese community in Canada. Treaty violations. MacDonald's government was involved in the negotiation and signing of treaties with Indigenous peoples, including the numbered treaties. However, the government often failed to uphold its obligations under these treaties, leading to the loss of land and resources for Indigenous communities and contributing to their impoverishment and marginalization. The national policy. While the national policy helped to build Canada's economy through protectionist tariffs and the construction of the Canadian Pacific Railway, it also led to the displacement of Indigenous peoples and the exploitation of natural resources, often without fair compensation or consideration for the environmental impact. The Pacific Scandal. MacDonald's government was embroiled in a major political scandal in the early 1870s, involving bribery and corruption in the awarding of contracts for the construction of the Canadian Pacific Railway. This scandal nearly brought down his government and damaged his reputation. The Red River Resistance. MacDonald's government was initially dismissive of Metis concerns regarding the transfer of the Northwest Territories to Canada from the Hudson's Bay Company. This led to the Red River Resistance in 1869–70, which was a direct challenge to Canadian authority and was only resolved through negotiations with the Métis leader, Louis Riel. Suppression of the Métis and Indigenous rights. MacDonald's approach to dealing with the Métis and other indigenous groups often involved the use of military force and the suppression of their rights. The execution of Riel after the Northwest Resistance was a controversial decision that further alienated many indigenous people from the Canadian government. It is important to recognize that while John A. MacDonald played a significant role in the founding. 10. Statue of Sir Thomas Pikon. Sir Thomas Pikon was a British Army officer and colonial administrator who served during the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. He is a controversial historical figure due to his involvement in the Peninsular War and the Battle of Waterloo, as well as his tenure as the Governor of Trinidad. Pikon is remembered for his military achievements, but he is also notorious for the atrocities and acts of cruelty he committed, particularly during his time in the Caribbean. The Trinidad Inquiry. After the British conquest of Trinidad from the Spanish in 1797, Pikon was appointed as the governor of the island in 1803. He is infamous for his brutal rule, which included the use of torture and executions without trial. His methods were so severe that they led to an official inquiry in 1808, known as the Pikon Inquiry. The inquiry found evidence of his cruel treatment of the local population, including the use of the Pikon's torture, which involved placing a person's feet on a board and driving nails into their soles. The execution of the Chaguaramas chief. In 1805, Pikon ordered the execution of the Chaguaramas chief, a local Carib leader who had been captured. The chief was bound to a tree and shot by a firing squad. This act was widely condemned for its cruelty and lack of respect for the local population. Suppression of the slave uprising. In 1805, Pikon played a significant role in suppressing the Santa Rosa Carib uprising in Trinidad. He is accused of ordering the burning of over 1,000 Carib men, women, and children in a cave, known as the Cumana Incident. This massacre was carried out to prevent them from joining the rebellion. The Battle of Buenos Aires. In 1806 and 1807, Pikon was part of the British invasions of the River Plate. He was involved in the Battle of Buenos Aires and was later criticized for his role in the mistreatment of Argentine prisoners of war. The execution of Spanish prisoners. During the Peninsular War in Spain, Pikon was accused of ordering the execution of Spanish prisoners who had surrendered. This incident occurred during the Second Battle of Oporto in 1809, where he was serving under the command of Sir Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington. The treatment of enemy prisoners. Throughout his military career, Pikon was known for his harsh treatment of prisoners of war. He was criticized for the poor conditions in which prisoners were held and for not adhering to the conventions of war regarding the treatment of the enemy. Waterloo controversies. At the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, Pikon was killed in action. Some controversies surrounding his death involve his alleged mistreatment of French prisoners and the fact that his body was mutilated by the French, which may have been a form of retribution for his reputation. Pikon's legacy is marked by these atrocities, which have overshadowed his military successes. His actions have led to a re-evaluation of his place in history and the consideration of his impact on the people and places under his command. His statue in Carmarthen, Wales, has been the subject of controversy and calls for its removal due to his involvement in slavery and the abuses committed during his tenure in Trinidad. These monuments are controversial due to the complex legacies of the individuals they represent and the colonial histories they symbolize. The debates surrounding their presence often revolve around issues of historical accuracy, cultural sensitivity, and the interpretation of national and international narratives of colonization and its effects on marginalized. Thank you for watching. If you are interested in this content, please remember to like, share, subscribe, and click the notification bell.